V has come too.
Welcome back to the cutscenes of The Phantom Pain. Please consider backing the channel on Patreon, liking, and subscribing for more. Let's begin. So we left off with Skullface in his first appearance in the game. It's a great example of what makes MGS5 so infinitely replayable, well, at least for me. Because there's great ambiguity to practically every word here that Skullface says, making it maddeningly impossible to say for sure what he's really hinting at. For starters, he says,
"You look well rested, big boss."
"You look well rested, big boss." Well, clearly that conveys that Skullface knows we've been in a coma for quite some time. I'm afraid 9 years. There's also the fact that he refers to you here as Big Boss, which seems to convey that we really do look like the legendary soldier. But you know, I keep getting hung up on something. People in The Phantom Pain keep referring to Snake's coma as sleep. That sounds an awful lot not like a reference to the real Big Boss's brain-dead coma, but Venom Snake's hypnagogic brainwashing kept artificially trapped in the liminal space between waking and sleep.
We've been busy over the last 9 years. His altered state of consciousness has helped us implant powerful suggestions through induced hypnagogia. He's experienced all your missions on record and shares all your knowledge and experience.
Of course, it is normal for people whose loved ones are in comas to refer to that situation as sleep. I mean, that makes things maybe feel less traumatic, less scary. So like lots of things, the true meaning behind this phrase is ambiguous. But considering the game we're playing, it can't be discounted that this is foreshadowing, a kind of double speak. And it only gets more doublingly ambiguous, hauntingly so, from here. Let's do our best to break down the following lines of Skullface one by one.
My, how you've changed.
My, how you've changed. Well, obviously that's quite a provocative, yet coy thing to say. Skullface seems to be alluding not only to Big Boss's face changing thanks to Skullface's own disfigurement, but to a larger sense of change. Big Boss now, after all, is something of a big shell, a phantom of his former selves, and I do mean selves plural, which we'll get to in a second. Now, the truly haunting line comes third.
You became a demon for such little weapons as that?
You became a demon for such little weapons as that? This indicates a trade, a Faustian deal with the devil. To reobtain freedom, strength, and his warrior's power, Big Boss, or at any rate you as his emissary, return to life in Japanese Oni demon style, all for revenge. But this line by Skullface seems to tantalizingly wink at something bigger than the mere honeybee, aka stinger, as our little weapons. To my ears, the little weapons, plural, can't refer to the rockets, and I'll tell you why. I think the little weapons may in fact refer to the Venom Snake ruse, and Snake's new sham MSF, Diamond Dogs. And of course the ultra irony here is Skullface is working on a different sense of the phrase little weapons himself, namely his little weapons, the vocal cord parasites, literally microscopic weapons invisible to the naked eye. But that's just one example of the rich irony that this character exudes. the bigger picture we'll see eventually, as he says in the next line? I think it's that there's no escape, no undoing what's already been done. In other words, our little weapons, Diamond Dogs and Venom Snake, won't be enough to save us, Big Boss, to save anyone. Revenge, Orwell once sagely argued, strictly speaking, is a fantasy. He was talking about World War II and the fantasies of revenge that many harbored and that had fueled the war. Orwell pointed out that revenge is just something we fantasize about when we don't have power. Once we actually have power, the fantasy, for most people, disappears. And even if we do try to seek out revenge, Orwell's point, and in this he echoes Nietzsche, is that there's no actual way to undo. Often what's done can't be undone. And if we try to do it back to them, it, strictly speaking, will not be the same thing. Skullface has already come to terms with all this. After all, he's literally the Walking Dead. I think his coming to terms with it is what makes him so terrifying.
Good. Now I have no regrets.
So I told myself, the pain and effort that keep me alive will never know relief, never bear fruit, never be repaid. I know that, but I told myself to focus on some hope, a non-existent hope, to guide me through this burning world. A hope. Call it a dream. A melancholic delusion. As the pressures within me stretch me to bursting, and I force myself not to cry out, though the words I thought were carved into me are gone, and all I knew is dead. I know how you feel. I've felt that. So show me that I'm not the only one, that you too can return to this world for revenge. Do you see me? Don't die. Don't die!
Life, humanity will not return. He doesn't even try anymore. Skullface has accepted he will not see triumph, not at least in his lifetime. He has nothing to lose, and that's what makes this character so compelling and so dangerous. No, instead of trying to resist what's coming, namely oblivion, Skullface has embraced it, clutched it close with lost hands, striding on his missing limbs. And that's exactly what he intends to make all of us by the end.
I'll see you in hell.
What makes Skullface so scary is he's decided not to resist death at all, but to become its emissary. What do I mean? Instead of trying to fight his fate, Skullface has now embarked on a mission to make the fate of the pain and the loss that he's endured, and we as Venom Snake have now endured, a global state of affairs. That will be his equality in loss. His monoculture to spread all over the world and make everyone like him.
Some of the fragments still remain. They are located near your heart and in your skull.
Like the husk of a man O'Brien in Orwell's novel, Skullface now works to proliferate the very suffering and nightmares that first made him this way, made him into this wreck, this shell, this living zombie, these eyes without a face. But that we'll get to in due time. Quintessentially, Skullface can only be understood as a product of the Stalin-era Soviet Union. It was Stalin's brand of totalitarianism that George Orwell famously satirized in his novel 1984. As Timothy Snyder writes in Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, quote, "For Stalinism, it was always easier to exploit the supposed actions of an organization that did not exist," end quote. And here, of course, I think of XOF, whose existence seems at best an open question throughout the game. I mean, after all, the name of their organization is derived simply by reversing that of one that we know exists, Fox. Their logo dimly resembling a kind of counterfeiting of Fox, both literally and symbolically. In 1984, the novel, the protagonist Winston Smith begs to know, does the Brotherhood, the secret underground terrorist cell he's accused of joining, even exist? The party's emissary, O'Brien, tells him that is a mystery that will haunt him until Winston's dying days. This is the same O'Brien who says to Winston at the end, quote, with a mild, almost regretful irony, "They got to me a long time ago." Do XOF really exist? Could such a strange outfit with such a flimsy proof of identity as an inverted Fox logo truly exist as they're presented? Who knows? Like Olga tells Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2, we have no choice to believe what we're told, no matter how much it seems to strain the bounds of plausibility. We have no choice because it's all we have.
Like you, vengeance is all he has. It's man's thirst for revenge that drives the times.
Skullface's appearance is of course exactly the same as during Ground Zeroes. This can't help but bring to the forefront of our minds for this scene the ongoing trauma of Ground Zeroes. It's a trauma that will, like the embers of the World Trade Center, continue smoldering long, long after the initial catalyst. The best thing about Skullface perhaps may be his irony, but in his disarming, old-fashioned, even gentlemanly way, Skullface is actually leaving hints and secret clues all over the place for us here to find. One thing to note is how the F in XOF is obscured. That leaves us with simply XO, both as in kisses and hugs, but also as in executive officer. According to the job description for an executive officer in thechronicle.com, quote, often referred to as XO, the executive officer takes the second-in-command position in an Army unit. The XO handles the administrative aspects of the unit with a focus on the day-to-day operational duties. Think of this role as the assistant to the unit commander, so the commander can focus on leading, end quote. There's a lot then to possibly draw from the innocent-seeming appearance of XO here, as well as its appearance in numerous other parts of the game. But really though, most of these stem from the same base emotions, shame and remorse. Because Skullface isn't just the guy who killed Chico and Paz, who sacked Mother Base and put Big Boss in a coma for 9 years. As we find out much later, he's also the guy who, during Operation Snake Eater, essentially served as our own XO without us knowing.
I've known you since your time at Langley. I've long been the other side of your coin. 1964, Soviet territory. Fox's first mission. Any mess you made, I was there to clean up.
Skullface defected to the West, eventually ended up with the SAS. That's where he met Zero. It's possible he began planning this whole thing back then. It's hard to say. In any case, Zero made him his XO. He always did have a thing for oddballs. But this one was set to lead a unit no one else would know about. When Zero created Fox, he also formed XOF as a support team. An unconventional special forces unit designed to support Fox, make it stronger, with Skullface giving the orders. Zero never even told the boss about it. Nor the CIA, naturally. If Fox was Zero's silver bullet, XOF was the recoil when he pulled the trigger. Just like Newton's third law. While you were with Fox, Skullface was operating behind the scenes. Sometimes as your backup, sometimes as a mole or a scout, sometimes as your cleanup crew. Fox's tail, making sure the mission succeeded and that you survived.
Now, some people really didn't like this, which they considered to be a retcon that diminished the myth of Big Boss. But for me, it brings to mind how in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, man is said to have dominion over all other life on Earth. It doesn't mention bacteria or microbes, of course, because for eons and eons the very existence of that invisible world went unnoticed. In other words, if our reality were fiction, the existence of microbes would be considered, like Skullface, something of a retcon. But it's only a retcon if we assume, erroneously, that Snake, let alone man, really is the hero, the main character in our story. Skullface handled the logistics, the cleanups, the day-to-day, while we, Naked Snake, got all the glory. I believe the point, at least one point to derive here, is that we were never just one individual named Snake or Big Boss. Snake is a superstructure, a construction relying on the load-bearing bulwarks of countless thankless others. The discrete identity of Snake, then, we might compare to that of a human being. Contrary to our eons-old beliefs and assumptions, the game tells us over and over again there is no single you. That modern science tells us you are, in reality, a hive-like superorganism, a superstructure, inseparable from the many microbes and bacteria residing inside you. This perhaps disgusting, awful truth we might compare to tasting of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It has a disempowering effect on the Metal Gear myth. Having eaten of that tree, having learned Skullface and XOF were dogging our tail in Selenoyarsk all along, now we can't escape that awful truth. Effectively castrated, we now know we can never adequately measure up to the legend of Big Boss. Skullface, alongside the rest of Unit Fox and XOF, helped Artifice. As Ocelot will say in MGS4, our weapons, we've learned, are not our own. In retrospect then, scenes like this with Skullface feel like an invasion. We start to wonder whether he isn't more us than we ourselves. The only me is me. Are you sure the only you is you? As we were asked in PT, it's a question here worth pondering. Nor will we, as a result of this, easily be able to disentangle ourselves from a sense of genuine culpability for the events of 1975. He's part of our best and our worst memories. Skullface is like a parasite that's co-evolved to become just another one of our many invisible microorganisms, a being who stretches the meaning of what we call, out of convenience, the self. The self was of course a major focus for Metal Gear Solid 2. In that game, we were told that, in the case of Raiden, self was just a mask contrived to hide away our very being. Much as the beauty of the face conceals the ugliness of the skull underneath. Self in this sense was just a half-self, a perfect light self, bereft of any darkness we didn't will to see. It's in the darkness, not of Shadow Moses, but of the human heart, Skullface dwells. Skullface is the heart of darkness personified, all the horror of the human soul in living, breathing form. A word, hideousness made flesh. A scuttling cockroach or insect in the shape of a man. Ruining our best ideas and hopes of ourself, trapping us in the guilt for the things that Skullface, in fact, much like O'Brien and Big Brother, instigated. Skullface, simply put, is annihilation. He is the word made flesh. He's where Big Boss, as a very idea, goes to die.
Here's to you, Nicola.
It's Skullface who will provide the other impetus for Big Boss's character arc, just as the Boss, in 1964, was the hero who taught us how to become heroes too. Skullface is the final instructor, the final villain, before Big Boss himself becomes a villain all of his own. And that will come once Big Boss 2 accepts, as Skullface here has conveyed, that there is no escape from the fate that we have been dealt. That, of course, brings up why the Phantom Pain perhaps features, at least on paper, a surprise reprisal from Metal Gear Solid 3, Yevgeny Volgin, now known simply as the Man on Fire. This individual we got used to thinking of as an individual has become an MGS5 yet another zombie, another superorganism whose life belongs not to himself but to the parasites inside him, who no longer has any real sense of self. The hatred apparently animating the Man on Fire is purely reflexive, a dim echo of the intelligence he once possessed. More a plant life form than human being, like us, the Man on Fire is a shell of his former selves. Consider here, by the way, all the fire and hell imagery that's been consistently portrayed by the Phantom Pain, how Quiet got burned, how the Diamond Dogs will wind up cremated, and so on. It's impossible not to consider all these things without also thinking, besides hell and eternal punishment and damnation, of Big Boss's ultimate fate he'll receive at the end of Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake.
A host of sorrows. And you are one of them.
The Phantom Pain, after all, tells the story of two characters we already know will meet tragic ends or near ends, as the case may be, in later games, Miller and Big Boss. Fitting then, we seem to be haunted by the specter of death himself, as Miller calls him the Grim Reaper lookalike, personified in the form of Skullface, an undead man with near religious convictions, fixated with fire, like an Old Testament prophet. Famously, in one of the promo videos for the Phantom Pain, directed by Kojima himself, we saw the slow transition along the hallway from Shining Lights Even in Death, as Naked Snake from Metal Gear Solid 3's face gradually morphs into that of Skullface, and the hallway becomes tied in our minds with the bloody hallway of Grey Foxes in Metal Gear Solid 1.
It's a ghost.
It turned out that this would spurn many rumors and myths that Venom Snake was in reality also Grey Fox. And that may be true, but personally I think this myth misses the forest for the trees here. I don't think the point is that Venom Snake is literally Grey Fox. The point is that whether we're talking about Grey Fox, Venom Snake, Big Boss, or Skullface, the same pattern plays out over and over again. The same status quo, the same machine-like logic asserts and reasserts itself again. Because these are not mere men, these are byproducts of a program.
Nothing more than iterations of the same oppressively uniform system.
The key passage on this point from Orwell is this. Quote, "The ideal set up by the party was something huge, terrible, and glittering. A world of steel and concrete, of monstrous machines and terrifying weapons. A nation of warriors and fanatics marching forward in perfect unity, all thinking the same thoughts and shouting the same slogans, perpetually working, fighting, triumphing, persecuting. 300 million people, all wearing the same face." End quote. That ideal Orwell speaks of the party, it describes Skullface's ideals for his revolution fairly well. It also, of course, describes Zero's revolution. All of the major players in this story are seeking to remake the world in their own image.
As the world saw the rise of digital technology, IT, the internet, and genetics, the Patriots' power grew immense.
Zero and I, liquid and solidus, we all fought a long, bloody war for our liberty. We fought to free ourselves from nations and systems and norms and ages. But no matter how hard we tried, the only liberty we found was on the inside, trapped within those limits. The boss and I may have chosen different paths, but in the end, we were both trapped inside the same cage. Liberty.
We see this during this scene also conveyed by way of the skulls. They quite literally take over the bodies of the Soviet soldiers, transforming them all into monsters with the same face. And of course, the way the skull's eyes glitter emerald green here, it's an explicit nod to another of Kojima's body snatchers, the literal body snatchers, the titular snatchers from his early adventure game with the same name. Strangely, when killed, the skulls here leave behind some sort of ectoplasm. The way it gives off this strange green and black vapor, reminiscent somewhat of the flower petals from Selenoyarsk when Snake killed the boss, which we also saw at the beginning of this game. It reminds me in turn also of Snatcher's particle Snow 9. Snow 9 was a bioweaponized pollen that could always be found whenever Snatchers were close. But more on the skulls, let alone Skullface and his master plan to snatch the face of the world, will come only in due time. For now, let's just focus on this. On the idea presented by the game we mentioned earlier, namely the idea that individuals are not individually made, but rather shaped over time, and as a process, according to both nature and environment. Not true discrete individuals, but in fact superorganisms.
Everyone here believes in you. Regardless of where they came from or why they're here, they revere you. And they're fighting because it was their choice.
And if it wasn't, they'd leave?
Who knows? That's our reality here, whether it's real or not. If there's another truth, I don't want to know it. All that matters is that's the concept that's taken shape in their heads. The traces of a group ideology, our superstructure, to put it in Marxist terms.
All right. Go on.
It's probably here we can mention a major influence and referent point for MGS5, Richard Dawkins' The Extended Phenotype. According to the Oxford Reference Glossary, the extended phenotype refers to, quote, the concept, advanced by British evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in his 1982 book of the same title, that the phenotype of an organism extends beyond its body to encompass the organism's behavior and the consequences of that behavior, end quote. Dawkins also would have included microorganisms that are necessary to our life as part of our extended phenotype. To save some time, let's keep this simple. Dawkins had already rewritten how modern biology thinks about replication and information transmission in his landmark earlier work, one heavily referenced by MGS1 and 2, The Selfish Gene. In the extended phenotype, however, Dawkins continued to challenge biological dogma. Rather than focusing on the role of discrete genes or gene clusters, Dawkins posited that actually the interrelations among genes and even across discrete organisms can't be broken down completely without losing something crucial. Why Dawkins came to this conclusion is also why the extended phenotype has such crucial importance for the Phantom Pain, and yes, even the character Skullface. It has to do with, in Dawkins' own words, quote, co-evolution, arms races, manipulation of hosts by parasites, manipulation of the inanimate world by living things, economics, end quote. How else could you explain, except by the theory of the extended phenotype, animals working in the interests of other animals' genes, or how multiple discrete organisms come together to become something greater than the sum of their parts?
If our world were a human body, you would be parasites. You make a living by doing the dirty work that the world powers cannot handle themselves. From their perspective, you are likely a nuisance. But without you, pus would build up around the world, and autotoxemia, self-poisoning, would follow. The world needs your kind.
Thank goodness for that.
Consider, for example, a theory first posited years after Dawkins' extended phenotype, in 2003, the old friends hypothesis. To quote newsmedical.net, quote, "The old friends hypothesis was proposed by Graham Rook in 2003 as an alternative or refinement of the hygiene hypothesis, originally brought forward in 1989 as an explanation for the rise in allergic disease."
Wake up soon, old friend.
The old friends hypothesis places an emphasis on the vital microbes that have been present throughout human existence as microbiota, tolerated latent infections, or in carrier states. This differs from exposure to other microbiotic infections that are responsible for causing colds, influenza, measles, and similar childhood illnesses. It is believed that the immune system depends on certain microbes that evolve together with the human organism. Thus, their absence may cause abnormal functionality of the immune system. End quote.
Just as those robbed of their parasites develop allergies and autoimmune diseases, a man robbed of his enemy develops self-destructive tendencies. And I know all the symptoms.
The old friends hypothesis is a direct byproduct of the shifts in scientific thinking caused in part by Dawkins writing the extended phenotype. But the wider philosophical implications have never been seriously laid out in print. These implications return us to MGS2 and its notion of the self.
That which you call self serves as nothing more than a mask to cover your own being.
In this era of ready-made truths, self is just something used to preserve those positive emotions that you occasionally feel.
Another possibility is that self is a concept you conveniently borrowed under the logic that would endow you with some sense of strength.
That's crap!
Is it? Would you prefer that someone else tell you? All right then, explain it to him.
Jack, you're simply the best, and you got there all by yourself.
If we think about it, self isn't easy to distinguish in the phantom pain from the not-self.
The body I've lost, the comrades I've lost, won't stop hurting. It's like they're all still there.
We're playing as a character whose mind has literally been infiltrated, conquered, and parasitized, if not colonized, by a foreign power. There are pieces of our self in our enemies, like Skullface. There are pieces of our enemies in our self. All just as there are literally pieces of pause embedded in our flesh and bones.
They noted their own citizens were 9 years ago, you were injured in an explosion. Upon examination, we discovered 108 foreign bodies embedded within you. In addition to shrapnel, we also found fragments of human bone and human teeth.
Back when I was in college, they used to present us in the philosophy department with a certain thought experiment. If you were to chop up my body and continue chopping it into a million little pieces, if you were to explode my body, perhaps we could say, with a bomb, at which point did the pieces that the bomb create become something other than my body? When does my identity cease to exist and become, in reverse American fashion, out of one many, e unum pluribus? What if I cut off my arm and welded it to yours as a replacement? Is that arm mine or is it yours? These are the sort of philosophical questions in the background that the phantom pain relishes in torturing us with, because they fly so completely in the face of our common sense, if you will, Western notions of the basics of life and existence. Is the only me, me? Are there multiple possible yous? Am I only me, or is me a construct formed almost as a composite, built on a whole host of outside experiences, influences, and relations, to say nothing of the consistency of my biology on the micro scale? Simply put, the phantom pain presents the self as a construct, something built, something to be made, something that can even be unmade. The key thing to realize about Skullface, however, is he is, to quote Solidus from Metal Gear Solid 2, something less than real, something even less than self.
Yes, that's right. you see a skull face. You see me. This skull is who I am. My mark, my proof of humanity. I have no country, no language, I have no face, but I haven't lost my skull.
Like those parasites who need us to live, Skullface is, in of himself, nothing. He's only the husk, a mere library, a cache of various foreign entities held together by purpling skin and bone. When we look at him, we are seeing a version of our own rotting corpse staring back at us. Maybe that's why nobody seems capable of looking him directly in the face. We can see the skulls briefly become skinless. This we'll later learn is thanks presumably to the ones that cover Code Talker's parasites, even if they aren't necessarily the same ones that cover the armor unit. As a reminder, the skulls are broken into divisions: the Mist unit, armor unit, and camouflage unit, respectively. It's very important to point out we didn't see any Soviets getting zombified in Episode 1. What we saw instead was vaporization, Soviets that the skulls presumably disappeared without a trace. We might presume that the skull's zombification powers are derived, or you might quite literally say evolved, out of the Pain's Hornet controlling powers back in 1964. The Mist unit's machetes are coated in metallic archaea, making their entrance in Episode 1 the first appearance of the stuff in the game. Although I've always wondered if Venom Snake's horn is not in fact a kind of metallic archaea, but that's for another video. Those giant rocks are also, of course, byproducts of the archaea. It's interesting for us to compare the three branches of skulls and speculate as to their purposes. Given their unique ability to appear out of mist, much like their sisters in the Camo unit, the Mist unit seems designed for, as their Snatcher-like appearance suggests, Snatcher missions. Missions just like the kind the boss says she conducted during the war. It was the nature of these Snatcher missions that first led the boss to devise CQC, which she would perfect only with the real Big Boss's help in the 1950s. Let's look at the Soviet soldier getting taken over closely. Is it archaea that allows the Mist unit to take over zombies, brainwash them as we, Venom Snake, have been brainwashed ourselves? Or is it some form of parasite, which might explain why the temporary zombie form they take so resembles Skullface and his purplish skin? The character we know has undergone extensive parasite therapy. As always, it's left unclear. We'll compare this scene later on to a nearly identical one that plays out at Nova Braga Airport. But in this boss encounter in Episode 6, yet again, we can choose to either fight or flight. But there's an added twist to this. We also have to choose whether to use the honeybee or not. Normally in the Peace Walker and MGS5 eras, a boss fight like this would be its own mission, giving us a chance to prepare. Not so here. You might be wondering why the CIA wants the honeybee with all its ammo intact. The real-world basis for the honeybee, the Stinger, has a notorious history in the region and war. Given to the Mujahideen by the CIA via their liaison, the Pakistani Secret Service, the ISI, though widely seen as turning the tide of the Afghan-Soviet war, some experts have actually questioned the extent to which Stingers were actually used on the field. It's possible the legend is no match for reality. There's a long story here about the CIA's failure to recover the Stingers, which then fell into the hands of anti-American militants after the war, that is, until their batteries ran down. I presume the CIA wants the missiles unfired in order to gift them to another unit of Mujahideen. Well, this gets somewhat explained in a subsequent tape. In that later tape, we're also finally explained the weapon's name. It derives from how the Man-Portable Air Defense System, or MANPAD, uses ultraviolet rays for tracking, just like the common honeybee. Ultraviolet rays are, of course, invisible to the naked eye. Just like microbes and parasites and the like. Fascinatingly, sometimes UV rays are used for a variety of chemical and medical purposes, to say nothing of the good old-fashioned bug zapper. One of Ground Zero's most haunting mysteries for yours truly is what exactly Skullface's black light or ultraviolet ray was all about. Delving into this too deeply would actually go over my head, but from what I can gather doing research on my own, there's some method of using UV rays to chemically activate certain compounds, somewhat like what we're seeing at the start of Ground Zeroes. It's also worth noting yet another nod to Snatcher here. I won't spoil that game, but there's something to do with UV rays there too. Let's not even get into climate change and UV light or we'll be here all damn night. Talk about a world singed by fire. For now, just remember that the entire mission, Episode 6, is likely nothing but pretext. Pretext actually set into motion by Skullface himself, as part of his first test of the vocal cord parasites. The stipulation not to use a stinger seems built into the mission parameters, perhaps as an added layer of torture. You have these powerful weapons, your very life is now in danger, yet you cannot use them. Your weapons are not your own. You act for the good of an outside force and at your own expense. The extended phenotype, perhaps, in action. It's worth noting one result of this mission will be Diamond Dogs obtaining portable missile capabilities of their own. If Diamond Dogs and Merc outfits like theirs have a role to play in Skullface's grand strategy, which they do, then leveling the playing field between them and superpowers like America almost certainly factors in. Time and time again in MGS5 we'll see this same pattern play out. We're given venom in the form of a gift. We think the missile's making us stronger against our enemies, but in reality it all but certainly is only bringing us and them closer together, making us even more integral to the coming New World Order. Private forces like ours will be the new armies this coming revolution in military affairs will bring. High-tech weapons and gear like the Honeybee will be crucial to that project. Another big question you have to ask here is, just exactly where did Skullface and Sahelanthropus come from? And much more importantly, how do they know exactly where you are and when to strike? We'll see later in Hellbound that, using the third boy's powers, Skullface and Sahelanthropus can appear out of nowhere. But in that mission too, yet again the same pattern plays out. The pair will jump us right on time. This can't help remind me of the famous opening of MGS2, where Ocelot says of Snake, "Our boy's right on schedule, he'll know soon enough." Doesn't that sound a bit like Skullface's, "Well, I suppose you'll see the bigger picture eventually"? Something to consider for sure. In multiple Metal Gear games, we see the use of tracking devices and transmitters. That could explain how they know your location. Ocelot even makes some veiled reference to this in one of the earliest tapes you get in the game.
Zero created Cypher, an information network to tap into every corner of the globe. Woven together, Cypher's arteries make the world just one big organism, and that's not all. It also monitors the thorn in Zero's side. That's you, tracking your coordinates wherever you might go.
We should also remember one of the series' more prominent examples of an ambush, when the boss surprised you as Snake was trying to extract Sokolov. Actually, that scene seems particularly crucial to remember here. We have the same sudden mist and a similar portable missile launcher too. Back then, the boss was delivering the Davy Crockett to Volgin of the East, and now Big Boss is delivering the Honeybee to the CIA, exactly 20 years later. Also notice that by doing the CIA's dirty work, we're no different than XOF, who did their dirty work back in the 1960s. And that takes us back yet again to the extended phenotype idea. We are Skullface and he is us. Just as Liquid tells Snake in MGS1, just as the Patriots tell Raiden in MGS2, they will exist for as long as we do. That gives extra special irony to Skullface's final lines here. Rest in peace this time, I'll see you in hell. That rest in peace line goes back to how I began, talking about how people talk about Snake's coma in this game. Apart from meaning, this time, please actually die, Skullface seems here yet again to be hinting towards he knows the awful truth. The truth we are Big Boss's phantom, brainwashed via sleep-derived mind control. That may be part of the bigger picture we'll see eventually.
Well, I'm sure you'll see the bigger picture eventually. If you get out of here alive. Rest in peace this time. I'll see you in hell, boss.
Of course, he could simply be referring to the idea that Big Boss, unable to rest in peace thanks to unfinished business, has come back from the dead. As always, it's impossible to say for sure. In a secret missable radio call during this mission, Ocelot will point out none of the Soviets present are wearing gas masks, as you'd expect if they had been the ones who wiped out the Hamid using biochemical weapons. If that even is what wiped out the Hamid, which at this point in the story we can only assume.
They haven't been issued any special gear. If they had used a biochemical weapon there, they'd be wearing masks at the very least. So what wiped out the Hamid fighters?
The reason there's no gas masks here is because the Soviets were not responsible. In fact, they have no better idea what happened than you do. It's difficult to prove, but I believe if you return to Dasmase Fort immediately after completing this mission for the first time, you will find Soviets there now wearing gas masks. At least that was the case for me when I replayed this game for the umpteenth time on PS4. Later, Code Talker will remark that none of the Soviets exposed to the parasite here became symptomatic. Presumably then, the entire ruse of this mission wasn't just for your benefit. The Soviets here, too, are part of it. They've been lured, just as you have, to serve as more of Skullface's test subjects. And I assume that if they do start wearing gas masks after this mission, that reflects the events at the end of this mission. You can see the Soviets actually fire on the skulls here before they are wiped out. Another nice touch, by the way, is the missile's serial number, which we can see someone looks to have tried to scratch off. Scratching off the serial is one way murderers and gangsters cover up their crimes, when it comes to small arms like handguns and so forth. That can't help but bring to mind, of course, Drebin and the war economy of MGS4. And of course, this is a direct case of a literal defacing. Sans serial, this particular stinger could be any of them. It becomes faceless, anonymous, not unlike, perhaps, Ishmael at the start of the game. The red ring around the missile's mouth reminds me of the AI pods so frequent in Peace Walker. More on them will be covered in due time. You can see the skulls suddenly regrouping around the legs of Sahelanthropus, again like in episode 1, each eye flicking on in radiant green one at a time. There are 4 of them, but as the camera closes in on our victim, one of the skull's eyes seems to disappear. In a nice, subtle, even secret touch, a millisecond later this missing skull appears directly behind the zombie's head. Misdirection using camera tricks like this is signature of MGS5. Now let's look very, very closely. We can see each stage of the parasitism playing out in real time. First, there's a black fugue of something like smoke that seems to push into the man's mouth. Stumbling, he then collapses. We then catch a brief glimpse of the exact same black smoke floating around the face of the skull. At this stage, the man's face is still fine. But then we're misdirected, which gives time for the chrysalis-like transformation that occurs off-screen. Now, a few moments later, his face has become like Skullface's. This is after the skull who snatched his mind performs a little gesture akin to a puppet master. Weirdly, this is very similar to a gesture made by Raiden when stationary in MGS2. If we slow the sequence down to 25%, we get a better glimpse at the transformation. There are lesions we see form on the man's throat, lips, and face, caused by contact with this foreign matter. This reminds me of two things: the real-world pandemic of the era, AIDS, which could cause skin lesions, and the film that greatly influenced MGS5 with a pockmarked villain of its own, the failed film of David Lynch's Dune.
Now you'll remember mine. I can kill with a word.
We'll talk about Dune and the famous scene containing the lines, "My words can kill," another time. Back to the Soviet soldier. We see the oil-like substance which the skulls leave behind when you kill them, and which somewhat resembles the strange substance oozing out of barrels all over the map, has formed quiet and code talker-like raccoon circles around the man's now opaque eyes, resembling here, again, code talker and also Miller. In this frame here, in particular, we can see everything the scene has to secretly show us, all in one image. The glittering green matter in the air like the splotches of camouflage on the man's fatigues, the many veins bulging and blackened by his poisoning, his eyes with strange lines all around the irises like little pale suns. Then as the camera pans back, we see the man now amidst the very smoke and green particles that consumed him, almost like he's been contaminated with radiation. Then the skull appears and the battle begins. One subtle clue as to Skullface's involvement we find in the picture included of the honeybee's case. Doesn't it look a lot like it was taken at Camp Omega? Notice something strange about the captured Hamid? He never makes a sound, even while being waterboarded. It seems the man's vocal cords were all but removed. Whoever did that certainly made sure he'd survive long enough from the vocal cord parasites to lead you right to the honeybee. We can learn during his enhanced interrogation that supposedly he ran away from the fort while the rest of the Hamid were dying. More likely, he was allowed to run to become bait for you and the Soviets. It's worth noting that the Hamid, as Pashtuns, share the same ethnicity and language as the group who after the war will become the Taliban. They are a minority this far north, however, making them suitable for Skullface's experiment without risking a runaway epidemic. I have to mention the doublethink evident in the juxtaposition of the Soviets torturing an Afghan alongside these giant propaganda billboards showing the Russians and Afghans living in peace and harmony. Another key Easter egg, by the way, happens once the mist rolls in. The radio turns from a Russian broadcast to the one from PT. Also note that when we listen to it, the mic levels indicate no sounds actually being made, just like, by the way, when Ocelot speaks in missions 1 and 2. Also, look what happens if you let the Hamid lead the Soviets to the honeybee. They pat him on the back, make him think they're just going to let him walk away, and then in a clever if subtle nod to a famous passage from 1984, do the inevitable and shoot him in the back. We'll close out here with the etymology of parasite. The word derives from Latinate roots, meaning to dine at someone else's table, to eat someone else's food. The only me is me. Are you sure the only you is you? Until next time, boss.